All right, everybody. Hope your quiz went well. This note session is just like I would do a lecture note in class, but just to give you some information to pair with the information that you're going to be reading in the textbook to hopefully make it all make sense. As you can do this, or as you'll see, there will be Edpuzzle questions popping up. So please take time to answer those, but also be recording this information in your in-class notes. The whole point of this is just kind of going through the major components of memory. There are a lot, and I would rather take time with you in class to go through like experiential learning, talk about how we've experienced this, but also get more into forgetting, which I think is a little bit more complicated. So please make sure you're also completing the modules coming up for this week to help put this all together and make it make sense. All right, so to start us off, I am not going to read this to you. You can pause and read for yourself, summarize it as you need to help it make sense. But essentially what's happened is that our understanding of memory, like all other parts of psychology, have changed over time. And we don't have this thought anymore of us working like computers where we just take in information and pop information out, right? We much more now focus on like this cognitive neuroscience piece, this idea of like what is happening in the brain versus what our experience is. And that has been our real kind of focus or multi-system model of memory for the last, I would say, like probably 40 years now coming up in psychology. Okay. And so because we are focused on this, we do focus particularly on the biology, but then we'll get into more experiential and then what's actually happening for us. So first thing you have to know is that there's no singular system. It's not like information comes in, like our sensory information going through the thalamus and then sorting to its correct location. There are different parts of the brain that are involved in memory that can work together, but that can also work independently from each other. So the major parts that we talk about usually are the cerebellum. The cerebellum, also involved in balance, movement, coordination, is involved in our procedural memory. So how I remember how to walk after learning it when I was little, how I remember how to ride a bike, how to tie my shoes. A lot of movement, what some people call muscle memory with that, just like the procedures, even going through how to set up my computer to take a quiz, right? That all comes through the cerebellum. Now we have the hippocampus as well. The hippocampus is much more still procedural, but you'll also get some more of that like newly encoded material coming in through there. You'll also get some, what we'll talk about later, as semantic memory coming in, linguistic memory, but very much kind of that new prime basic information. Whereas the amygdala gets a little closer to storage. Where is our memory stored? How is our memory stored long term? You'll also see emotional memory tied to this because we know our amygdala is very, very closely related to our emotions and our fight or flight. So those are your big three. Now, of course, there are other that come into play, temporal lobe, kind of going with that auditory or occipital lobe if we want to visualize. But these are your three main players when it comes to cognitive neuroscience in the brain. Now, what a memory is actually just a neural pathway. When we talked about the parts of the brain, those are the parts of the brain responsible for kind of processing the information, but it's not like they're file cabinets and storage. It's not like I can look in your brain and point to where a memory exists. All a memory is the neural pathway taken by a particular set of neurons. So when a message fires from the cell body down to the axon, over the synapse to the receiving dendrites of the receiving neuron, up through the axon, outside the axon terminals, etc. As that pathway is happening, that is actually the memory, the pathway it takes. So if we're to look at an image of neurons, this is a cluster of neurons in someone's brain, you can see that some clusters are closer together, some are farther away, but there's this intricate web. Depending on the pathway that the neurons take or that the neurons fire, that is going to be a memory. So if you see some of them are clustered a little bit closer together, some memories come up to us quicker than if they're trying to take a longer path to it, right? So, and that leads us into an idea called long-term potentiation. And all this is saying is that essentially the neural basis for learning and memory are these neurons firing, and their potential after, or like how quickly they can fire, is going to be what allows us to remember things quickly, right? So there you could also see this as like strengthening synapses and helping those transmission between neurons to help us remember faster. This is all very complicated. And again, I am not a scientist. I'm not a cognitive psychologist. So how I keep this in my head and how I understand it is long-term potentiation is essentially like this. You have two paths in the woods, right? One is not traveled very often. It's overgrown, it's hard to walk. But this one has been maintained, it's been used again and again, it's been worn down. This is like a well-worn memory. This is somebody studying the information for the test again and again and again, rehearsing the information, making it so those neural pathways can fire easily, versus someone who maybe checks out the information at the beginning of the chapter, will check in at the very end, won't have a clear pathway. Can you get through? Yes. Is it difficult? Yes. So this whole idea is the more you rehearse, the more you go through, the more you use those pathways, the easier the memory to retrieve, and the easier it is to kind of pull that information into your working memory. So memory is divided then into three major parts, right? Sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory. Most of us know short-term memory and long-term memory. Long-term memory, obviously, memory that sticks with you for a long time. It can actually last for an infinite amount of time. Short-term memory is pretty quick. We actually don't really use the phrase short-term anymore. This is more of a working memory model, which you'll see, which means that not only is it there quickly, but you can actually keep the information pretty fresh. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a moment. But we also have sensory memory. And this should clue you into what this is going to be talking about, right? Because we've already talked perception and sensation. So these are the different senses and how we're actually taking in information. So you could have haptic, which is like a touch. So you can remember if somebody comes up and like pinches you, you can still feel that linger. Echoic is memory that you hear very briefly. So it could be somebody calling your name, giving you some sort of information. It does not stay in your memory very long, right? Iconic is what you see. That could be walking past you real quick. Olfactory is if you smell like something really quickly. Gustatory, like any sort of taste, right? These stay in your memory for a very short amount of time, if at all. Okay, so let's check out what that looks like in this. So this is our Atkinson-Shiffrin's model, and this is information processing model, also known as the multi-store model, also known as the three-stage model. This is our current working model of memory, right? So what we can see here is that there are external events that happen around us that gives you sensory input, right? So here's your sensory memory right here. So this is what we talked about with sensation and perception, particularly with what we pay attention to and what we don't. Because remember, with sensory adaptation, you're not taking in most of this information. And truly, if you don't pay attention to it, it's lost. It doesn't even stick in here it can last anywhere from like a half a second to 3 seconds, barely anything. So that's happening constantly. And depending on if you pay attention to it or not, you may not even notice it. But then what happens is the part that you do pay attention to, it goes into your working or short-term memory through a process we call encoding. So encoding is just putting information into your brain. So this working or short-term memory, this can only hold information for a short amount of time. And if you don't rehearse it, if you don't pay attention to it, it's lost. It drops out of your memory, right? But the more you rehearse it, the more you actively try to remember, the more you focus on holding on to it, the more it stays, and then you can encode that, then put it into your brain, into your long-term memory. So your long-term memory is actually infinite. You can hold as many items as the world can fit, right? Which sounds weird because we often have trouble with this part right here, which is the retrieving, or another word for that is remembering, okay, which is pulling information into your short-term memory. But this long-term memory, it can hold things forever if you need to. However, some info may be lost over time, and that could be anything from depending on age, particular injuries. But if you look theoretically, you might not ever lose anything from your long-term memory. It's just all going to be about how easy can you retrieve the information coming to you. Okay, some parts are automatically processed. So that means it goes from external all the way to long term, happens, right? But I want to put your attention to this big green arrow, because this big green arrow is you, right? Your working or short-term memory is also your current kind of consciousness. This is where most of us are operating out of most of the time. So if we retrieve information, it's coming into our working or short-term memory, where it will either go back or eventually drop out if it's unrehearsed. Okay. Here's another working model of, it's the same thing as the Atkins-Shiffrin, it just shows a little bit more detail. Again, you can see this information coming in. Again, we have automatic processing coming from the sensory that goes ahead and goes into long-term memory without any sort of like effort. You just happen to remember something, right? It could be, hey, what were you wearing on Tuesday of last week? Okay, you probably didn't have to go through with a lot of effort. It was just there and you can access it, right? So especially because you can see how the time change goes for each level of memory. For our next section, we're going to go through and we're going to focus on mostly encoding and then retrieving. So if you want to go ahead, take some time, wrap up these notes. See you in the next video for some more specific information.